We published a history which is on sale here at the town offices and has been on sale other places. And that town history has a section in it on Clarendon Springs, and I referred to that a little bit in some of my presentation, or I will. It was done by Beth Round Smith, and she has a very different style than I did. When I wrote an article when I was a junior in high school on Clarendon Springs that was published in Vermont History, because it was part of the Edmonds essay contest that went on statewide for high school students. And I was a third place winner in, must have been 61 probably, or 60 maybe, 1960. And then it got published subsequently in July 61. And that's primarily what I have used for this presentation, is the article in the July 1961 Vermont History. And as I say, I have a very different style as a student under supervision of a teacher. And Beth Round Smith's style is much more flowing and eloquent, and it contradicts in some ways some of the stuff that I had put into my essay. So there's differences of opinion, as you might expect, about history. A lot of what I wrote was based on these three, because there was no Clarendon history ever published prior to 76 or whatever. The first effort and place you would look for Clarendon history is the Vermont Historical Gazetteer by Abby Hemingway. And it was written around 1876, I think, published. And she's a crackerjack. This is like one of 5 volumes. And it's expensive to buy an original one. I don't know if it was reprinted, it may have been. But the Rutland County chapter is in volume 3, and it costs about a couple $100.
Where do we get access to that book?
They have it at Rutland Library.
You do? Okay.
So you can use it there. In many other libraries around, it's not uncommon.
Clarendon have it?
I don't know.
Okay.
I would kind of doubt it, because they probably don't keep valuable books for reference, but you don't have far to go to get a copy if you wanted it. Then these next two kind of, I think, borrowed to a large extent, although they didn't copy exactly what's in Abby Hemingway's book on Clarendon, or not book, the whole book isn't on Clarendon, but one little chapter is. And so this is the Rutland County Smith and Rands, it's called. And it has a similar kind of chapter on Clarendon as well as other towns in Rutland County. And then the third one is Child's Gazetteer. And that was published, actually this was published last. This was published in 1881-82. And this, because it's a business directory, it has quite a bit about the Clarendon Springs operation in it. And it isn't exactly like these others, but it contains much of that information.
So those belong to you, David?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have
those
kind
all
of,
3 should be available at Rutland?
yes, all 3 of those would be available at Rutland in the Vermont room, along with a whole lot of other stuff. They have a really nice historical collection there. So the first kind of note about Clarendon Springs is reference to 1776 with a person named Asa Smith, who lived over on the east side of town, and he had a dream. And he dreamed that in the western part of town there was a spring that would restore his sort of failing health. And so he went looking for it, and he found it. And so he saw the subject of his dream, and it was the Clarendon Springs, and he applied the clay that was there in the springs to his ailing limbs, you know, whether he had rheumatism or whatever it was. He got fast relief, and he returned back to East Clarendon, and it satisfied his health and sort of restored it. And so the next reference in history is in 1781, George Round. He moved from the wilderness, he moved into the wilderness of the Clarendon Springs area from down in Connecticut. And his brother had bought 3 rights, original rights, from a grantee in the area of where the Johnson farm is, or the Bowen farm, on the Creek Road. And so this George Rounds moved from Connecticut up here with his brother and just lived over the mountain, essentially, where Clarendon Springs is relative to James, was the other guy, was his brother. And I'll sort of give a disclaimer. He's actually, George Round is actually my great-great-great-grandfather. And I didn't know that when I wrote this article. I've just figured that out later in life. As things happen in life, you hear things, but, you know, that's quite a thing to discover. And he's also a Revolutionary War veteran, and he's buried up in Chippenhook Cemetery. So the founder of Clarendon Springs. You got to remember, Clarendon Springs had no church and no cemetery, so they pretty much used Chippenhook for that purpose. And his first recollection, George Round, of the springs being called mineral or used medicinally was in 1793. So some time went on from the time he moved there in 1781 until 1793. And the springs was originally apparently kind of a barren area, and it was described as about 10 rods in diameter, or in circumference, well, 10 rods across. And it resembled kind of cindery remains of a lime kiln. And much of the area had this very soft white clay that was very fine and delicate. And, you know, that would be the stuff that Shaw supposedly applied to his ailing limbs. And the Rounds first built a log house to live in, and then they took in boarders as time went on. It was really quite a wilderness at the time he moved into it. And that was in 1798, he constructed a large frame house. So he upgraded his house and opened what was called the American House. And that was the first Clarendon Springs hotel, and it was located southwest of where the Clarendon House is today. And from then on, from that 1798 time, the fame of Clarendon Springs started to grow, and its ability to conquer some of medicinal woes started to grow. And among the first claims of medicinal value were from a man named Shaw, and it was around 1800 that he applied some of this white clay from the springs and got a cure, allegedly, for cancer. And so, with kind of, what do they call it when somebody supports an idea?
Like an endorsement?
An endorsement, that's the word I was looking for. So with these kind of endorsements, the word spread, and business opportunities started to pick up in the area. And the next kind of major construction that took place was in 1835 when they built what you see there now. It's owned by Tony Constantino, the Clarendon Springs house. And it was as large and lavish a resort hotel as there was anywhere in the state. And it made Clarendon Springs kind of the pioneer of the numerous springs areas that were to pop up around Vermont at around that time, like Middletown and others. And the Clarendon Springs house, as you go by, you can look at it, and it's 5 stories high. You know, it's quite a formidable building. It's for sale now, actually. And it has dormers and sun porches on it. The bottom 3 floors are sun porches, and the top floor is a dormer. It has dormers on it. And it has 52 rooms and can accommodate up to 100 guests. And as you can see in front, there's this pond, and there used to be an elaborate fountain there. There's still a water feeds off the higher location up on the mountain, on the West Mountain, feeds by gravity. It isn't the spring water, but it's water from up on the mountain that feeds that pond. And accumulates quite a lot of ice in the winter, if you've noticed that going by. And there was a large lobby, a dining area, and a ballroom comprised most of the first floor in there. So there tend to be big rooms, not really sleeping rooms on the first floor. And the spring site is located across the river in the back. And there's a footbridge that goes across the river. It's there to this day, or a bridge is there to this day. And the spring house is still there. I don't know if it's the original spring house or if it was one that's been built since, but I went there and looked at it just before I came here, and I noticed they have new shingles on the, so somebody's maintaining it. Last I knew, it was owned by Art Knox. I don't know if that family still has it or not. And there was, and so they pumped water from that spring over to the hotel across the river so that people could bathe in that, medicinally described water. And there was a large livery adjacent to the hotel that provided horses for tours. They charged 50 and 75 cents for a person for tours, and they would also deliver people down to West Rutland where they could catch the train, and they would obviously bring guests up to the resort from West Rutland where the train tracks were. If you have questions as we go along, you feel free to ask any questions or intervene if you wish. So in 1866, with both Clarendon and the American houses being profitable, there was a wealthy investor came along named Byron Murray, and he purchased the entire complex there. And he formed what was called the Clarendon Mineral Springs Company. And he had 2 sons, Robert and George, and they operated really that whole complex until it ceased operation in 1898. So it went pretty much up to 1900 before it closed. And then it was run temporarily. Another relative of mine ran it for one summer, or a couple summers, as sort of a tea house in the summer. And that would have been in the early 1900s sometime. And Murray's operation was only in the summer and the fall. They didn't try to run it year round. They ran it during foliage season. And the terms were $8 to $12 a week for room and board, $5 to $6 for children, $5 for servants. You got to remember, a lot of people from the South came up, and they had servants and maybe even slaves. And it was $2 a week for board. That wasn't a day now, that was for a whole week. The Murrays also owned a 170-acre farm. I don't know exactly where that was, but they supplied vegetables and produce to the hotel for consumption during the summer and the fall. And there were hunting and fishing opportunities right nearby, obviously, for guests and sportsmen. And for those that were kind of less active in terms of their ability to participate in fun sort of stuff, there was bowling and croquet and billiards available, all there in the hotel or nearby. Mail went out daily to West Rutland, and there was a Western Union telegraph office in the hotel. And I've seen in the guest register, the Jumbo with the Barnum and Bailey Circus apparently came through and stayed there at one time, and Jumbo is signed in the guest book. So, the big sideline of the Clarendon Springs Mineral Company was bottling and shipping of Clarendon Springs water. And the bottle works were located in the basement of the hotel, and they filled bottles from the size of pints to carboys. And carboy is a 5-gallon container. And the market was national. It got sent all over the country at the time. And for many years, even after the hotel ceased operation, they still bottled water there and sent it out because it was profitable. My Uncle Dick actually told me on his way to high school from up in the Hook, he went to West Rutland High School, he would carry water for shipment, later on, and that was probably in like the 30s or something like that. He was still doing that. It was just a part-time thing. And the water was analyzed sometime prior to 1839, and a gallon of water, which is 2.35 cubic inches, was said to contain carbon acid gas, 46 cubic inches, carbonate of lime, 9.6 cubic inches, muriate of lime, 3.02 grains, and a grain is 64 milligrams. So not very much, but there was a touch of lime in this water. And then it had some sulfates in it, sulfate of soda and sulfate of magnesia. It had only 2.7 grains, and it had nitrogen gas in it. And the medical world endorsed this water as a preventive and cure for diseases of the skin and the nervous system, impurities of the blood, kidney and liver complaint, and restoration of deficient appetite. So you can see it was pretty good stuff. It was a cure a lot of different things. And it's the same time as there was a lot of patent medicines around that made similar kinds of claims. So for 25 years under the management of the Murrays, the Clarendon Springs was noted as a mecca of fashion for people of wealth and culture. J.P. Morgan is said to have come there with an 8-horse coach and two coachmen. So as an example of people that had a lot of means that would come there to stay. The American house was torn down sometime shortly before World War II, and the Clarendon house, of course, still stands. It's there now, and there was another hotel built there that wasn't, maybe Murray's bought it, I'm not sure, but it was the Green Mountain House, and it was owned by James Flowers and built by Silas Green. And I know the first potter on the land where I live, which he bought that land in 1820, he bought it from Silas Green. So Silas Green built the Green Mountain House, which had 20 rooms in it, and it was located somewhere in the area to the south and west of where the Clarendon House is. And it burned in 1866. And this is talked about in Beth Round's account. There's also the Stone Building, which exists in Clarendon Springs. It's south and west of the Clarendon House. And that served as the laundry for the hotel. At least a portion of it did. And it housed many of the people that worked there at the big Clarendon House. They would live in what's now the stone house. It's still there. And then there's a building to the east of the stone house. That was Seaman's house. And then it became Miriam's store. So every little community had to have a store. And that was what served that purpose. You know, there's a few other things that they're in these books and also in Beth Round's account, but they had big families back then. And so there was like 7 or 8 families in Clarendon Springs, and they had as many as well, I can just read them off here. James Harrington and Polly Bates had 12 kids, of which 10 were scholars. They'd gone to school there. And then Theophilus Harrington and Betsy Buck, they had 12 children, with 11 of the 12 going to school. There's William Harrington and Amy Briggs, had 17 kids, and 13 of them went to school. George Round and Martha Hopkins, that's the founder of Clarendon Springs, had 12 children and 12 scholars. John Siemens and Sarah Westcott, the Westcotts later owned what's La Victory's now. That what used to be the Westcott farm. And they had 12 children and 12 scholars. And Charles Siemens and Maidabel Esborn had 16 kids and 16 scholars. Richard Weaver and Judith Reynolds, 13 scholars, or 13 children and 11 scholars. And Richard Weaver is also one of my great-great-great-grandfathers, and also a Revolutionary War soldier buried in Chippenhook Cemetery, and he fought at the Battle of Hubbardton and at Saratoga. Jonathan Eddy and Temperance Pratt had 19 children, and 14 of them were scholars. And if you add up all of those kids, it's 113 kids and 99 scholars. So can you imagine Chippenhook had to have a school that accommodated 99 kids? And supposedly Tony Costantino's house, the brick building there in Clarendon Springs, right on the main drag, was the schoolhouse. It had an upstairs to it and a downstairs. And so, you know, the schoolhouse that my cousins went to that lived in Clarendon Springs, they went to the old school on Schoolhouse Hill Road. That's the one just north of Clarendon Springs that goes up on the hill and joins the Coeur d'Alene Road eventually. So I have here a few artifacts. This is a Clarendon Springs bottle, to the best of my knowledge, and you can see it's not embossed. Instead, they use labels. And these are the labels that I have. This is the one that's in the book, and many of you have seen this. I think you can pass these around. And then this is one that shows the nature of the water. And this was another one that I found in the basement of the hotel. And then, kind of as a competitor, I happen to have a Middletown Springs bottle that is embossed. And so you can pass that around, you can see what one looked like. I think they have a another color, Middletown Springs bottle. I think there was a couple different styles.
A couple of questions.
Yes.
I'm not from Clarendon.
Yeah.
The river by the Clarendon Springs, what's the name of the river?
Well, it has a lot of names, but it comes out of Tinmouth. It comes out of Tinmouth Pond or Chipman Lake. That's what starts the,
Okay.
it's called Tinmouth River in Tinmouth. It's called Clarendon River in Clarendon. It's also, in the old days, it was known as Furnace River because there was, up in the between Chippenhook and Tinmouth, there were iron foundries along that river. And they used the water power to run the bellows to, fan the, to get it really hot. They had to fan the fire, so to speak, the charcoal or whatever they used to melt that iron. And they made pots and pans and stoves. And now, you had another question?
The second was, the fame of the Clarendon Springs, does it predate the fame of the Middleton Springs?
Yeah, supposedly, they're probably essentially overlap for a great period of time, but the Clarendon Springs, according to what I read, was the pioneer springs industry of the state of Vermont. They were kind of the first one to go big time and get a lot of traffic coming to stay there. And I think it's a little more than an irony that it was sold to the Murrays in 1866. It would be right after the Civil War. So I have a feeling the owner at the time was, kind of seeing or sensing that, the Civil War was going to take away a lot of the southern customers that were coming there. There was a large group of southern people to avoid the heat would come north for a period of time. That plantation owners that had wealth, and Beth Round talks about that in more flowery, glowing terms. And but I'll just say to you factually that that's, I think, was logical, but she describes it in a much more eloquent way. Just her style is very different. And she says there's like 100 rooms in the hotel. She also said there was 3 floors. Well, you can see readily there's 5 floors if you just drive by and glance at it. But, so she was older, when this book was published. I was just a kid, really. Well, I wasn't a kid when this was published. I was in my, probably about 30 when this was published.
Was she a local or was she an outsider?
Well, she was around, Beth Round Smith,
Okay.
So she was a descendant of George Round. I never called her my cousin, but she was, right? But I didn't know it at the time.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
there's a lot of.
it's just like John is my cousin. Did you know that? John and I are cousins. So.
And they try and write about
We
it.
got a common ancestor in Chippenhook Cemetery.
And I'm wondering if that's what happened to her back then.
Yeah, in the Congdon. So, if you're from an old Chippenhook family, if you've descended from them, you're probably related. Because if you think about it, the old days before cars, you had to marry somebody pretty close to you because you couldn't go very far to choose different people. So it was a lot smaller range of choice.
Yeah. Do you
Yes.
think they still would find mud down that way? Mud, is that still visible at the?
I don't, of course, the spring house sits over a fair area there, probably
Yeah.
there's 20 feet or something square maybe. And so I don't know what it really looks like. I didn't go up and look in the windows to see what the spring looks like. It's probably been, cement around it or something now. It wouldn't surprise me. But if you look outside that spring house, it's just kind of wet, swampy. It's grown up to weeds and stuff. And it's not an attractive looking place. I think, you know, there's a pipe coming out of the spring house, and people go there to get water. I think, you know, different people do that.
I was just gonna ask if that's still public access or whether that has now been
No,
put on
it's-
posted
it's-
land.
there's a sign that says private on the spring house, but I know people go across that bridge, and it's town, I'm pretty sure it's a town highway, because when I was on the select board, we had an issue with, they were gonna develop that spring area, and sell water from it, and they were gonna park a tractor trailer in there, and it was gonna have to idle for quite a long period of time while they pumped water into it, and it became a, I don't know if you've ever served in public office, but everything you do isn't always welcomed by everyone in the public. And that issue was a thorny one. And anyway, the select board ruled that it wouldn't probably be in that neighborhood's best interest to have a truck idling down in that. If you go there, you'll see it's a very narrow road, but it's a public road, I believe, all the way to the river. And, because we were involved in the decision, and we wouldn't have been if it was private. And there's a trailer there. People live right on the edge of that road.
I wondered if there was ever any competition between the two sources of water, and if there was any comparison ever made between them.
Between what two sources?
The
Middletown.
Clarendon
Oh,
and Middletown.
I'm sure they were competitors probably at one point in time. You know, they were both looking for the same kind of clientele. And, you know, I don't know the details of that, but you can imagine that, you know, they were in competition with each other, and they weren't alone. There were other springs areas in Vermont that got into this. It was a thing for a while to come to Vermont and enjoy the health benefits of living here and enjoying the water.
Medical tourism.
Yeah, and it would cure anything you had probably, you know, or at least help to.
Is there any hotel in Middletown related to that?
Any,
Hotel of any type of large accommodation?
oh, I
guest?
think at one time they had something there. I'm sure they did. I don't think it exists now
I
though.
mean, there's a lot of big houses, so
Yeah.
I can't,
Yeah, I
You know
believe,
David, right?
I believe they did. It was on the other side of the river
Yeah.
from where the spring house is.
Oh, yeah.
And I think they had tennis courts and things over there, and there was a footbridge that went from
To spring
the,
to the
this, the spring to the hotel.
That could have been the earliest tourism in
Didn't they get
Vermont.
flooded out
Yeah.
though?
That's
Yeah.
right.
There was a problem with the
Yeah.
flood,
Yeah.
taking a lot of that out.
It buried the spring house. They had to
Yeah.
dig it back out to make it what it is today. Yeah. Dave, I have a question about, the water supply for the hotel, Clarendon Springs Hotel. Cause you talked about the mineral water being bottled and then people would bathe in it. And where did the fresh water come from and the source of that, fountain? Is that from the same hillside? Or does that come down from,
The healthy water, the kind that was bottled and bathed in, came from across the river in the spring house that exists there today. And the water that feeds the fountain and the pond in the front of the hotel comes from across the road, the main tar road, and up on the hill.